All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're at the hour. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, From Soil to Stream, No-Till Mixed Covers and Farm Stewardship. I'm Ashley Chesser with Wild Farm Alliance, and I'm happy to have you here with us today. Let's get started by having folks just enter into the chat your name, if you're affiliated with an organization or a farm, and where you're located. It's always fun to see that from folks. And then while you're doing that, I'm going to give just a few quick bits of information about Wild Farm Alliance and what we do, and then I'll pass it to our speakers. So since the year 2000, we've been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. We've got three program areas and a 2050 vision to kind of see some big successes in those areas. So we aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our Farmland Flyways program. Hedgerows to the Moon and Back, which is about 500,000 miles in our Farmland Wildways program. And then 10% of river frontage on farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to about 100,000 miles of riverine habitat. So this is the program area we're focusing on today. So not just habitat, but soil health related to waterways. And then I also wanted to call your attention to a soil health and habitat field series that we are launching next week. We've got 4 field days around the Northwest and Northern California. So if you live in any of these areas in Washington, California, Oregon, and Idaho, we really hope you'll join us. I think we've got someone can put the link in the chat, but if you go to our website and look at the events tab, you can see all of our events there. These are going to be fun ways to kind of see some of these conservation practices and biodiversity efforts in action. Today's webinar has been approved for one continuing education credit with the American Society of Agronomy. So if you're interested in getting credit for today, please have your license number handy, and we've got an evaluation form at the end where you can enter that. I'm excited to introduce Andy Livesay from he's from Westwood Farms, which is near Salem, and he is in charge of the farm operations there. And then we also have Shannon Cappellazzi. She's the organic soil specialist at Oregon State University Extension. We're going to hear about the science and the practices on the ground that are happening to improve soil health and just kind of the overall holistic management of farms. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Andy to get us started.
Okay. All right. So today my name is Andy Livesay. I'm the senior farm manager here at Westwood Farms where I am today. I'll talk a little bit more about the farm here in the intro, but yeah, I'm going to talk about, farming for biodiversity, regenerative hop farming at Westwood Farms. We have really taken a big interest in regenerative farming and biodiversity and soil health and water conservation. And so I'm going to talk about sort of that from a high level today. Um, I have a lot of slides, but a lot of pictures of what we've been doing. I went out yesterday and took a lot of recent pictures, which always go better in a webinar, I think. So, yeah, feel free to stop me at any time. Guess that's up to the presenters or the organizers a little bit. We probably won't have too much time, but I believe we'll have time for questions at the end. So we'll roll into this. So Westwood Farms, what we do, a little bit about us. We are um, about 900 acres located in Oregon's Willamette Valley, just north of Salem, Oregon there, as you can see on the picture. So kind of north central Willamette Valley. We're right down along the Willamette River in the floodplain, so lots of riparian areas that we're helping to manage as well. We're primarily a hop farm. About 95% of our revenue comes from hops. That's what we're focused on. We also grow some hazelnuts and grow some malting barley. So heavily influenced or heavily what am I thinking of? Heavily involved in the beer and brewing industry. That's what I meant to say. So spend a lot of time with our local brewers here and brewers all over the world, and that's that's a big part of what we do as well. Something that's also a part of the farm is a lot of native habitats, so we include that sort of in our management scope, and then we have some leased and fallowed farmland as well. So Westwood Farms is a family-run, value-driven farm. The family's been farming for a long time. They're one of the early hop farming families here in Oregon. For those of you who don't know, this has been a hop producing region since the mid 1800s, I believe. So a long tradition of hop farming. Right where we are actually located, there's the forests are filled with wild hops from 100 years of everyone dumping their hop trash and waste into the into the river bottom. So that's presents some challenges for us, but yeah, and we're really committed to regenerative farming and conservation. It's been a really fun place to work. A little bit about some of our sustainability partnerships. So, Salmon Safe has been a huge part of what we do here in terms of watershed health, farming practices, and making sure those are all aligned. Actually, Salmon Safe was who introduced me to Wild Farm Alliance, and we're excited to make acquaintances with them and look to be more involved here. Green Chief is our hop-specific sustainability standards, and then we do a lot of research with U of O and OSU cooperators on our farm. So U of O has a really neat native cover crop study right now in our hazelnut orchards, which is really cool. One of the more exciting projects I've been a part of. And then OSU, we do a lot of agronomic research and some brewing research with Dr. Shellhammer's lab. So heavily involved there, and then also with our NRCS and local watershed councils for advice and for funding. So if anyone has any questions about that, we're been deeply involved in that. So a little bit about myself. Yeah, lifelong naturalist from a really early age. So it's been exciting to blend professional and personal interests here with these kind of presentations and what we do every day, but big time into, outdoor pursuits. Professionally, started at agriculture when I was 14 and then worked on my neighbor's farm, worked for the USDA breeding program and plant pathology for a long time, and did crop advising for 10 years before starting at Westwood here as getting into the farm management side. All right. So, sorry, I'm trying to figure out here how to get my presentation mode, but it's not happy with me. Anyway, so if I'm looking at my other screen, it wasn't intentional. Um, let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. So regenerative farming at Westwood, what does this look like, right? It's this buzzword that's sort of, been taking shape over at least the last decade. It's become a big part of, the discussions of agriculture in this country and around the world. There's many definitions. One definition I like, this is from Kiss the Ground, which is a certifying entity. But, I just won't read it all, but just highlighted some of the terms that I like and then, things that I might add. So I think you'll see in this presentation, definitely focused on systems, holistic is used a lot. Biodiversity is critical to the functioning of this and success of this type of farming. Productivity, biodiversity again, and healthy soil. Some things I might add is at least something about ecology. I think that's a big focus. Certainly for Westwood and what I'm doing. I think it should be a focus for farming more generally. Habitat conservation, that's something that I have a background in, and I've been really excited to, use some of these lands that, there's so much land on our farms across this country that, could serve as really quality habitat. Some of it does, some of it doesn't. So that's something we've focused on. Resource conservation and climate resilience. So those are some of the things I'll talk about that we've sort of built, building on this kind of a definition. But like I said, something myself and other people involved in this have been talking a lot about is trying to define this, and there's a lot of different certifications. There's a lot of different definitions. It's generally pretty positive, but we're still working through this. So what it looks like at Westwood, we're focused on three things. So we're really focused on biodiversity. I think that's probably our number one thing right now, at least. We're focused on water quality and we're focused on climate resilience. So this presentation is going to be broken down on those three categories, and I'll kind of run through, our main management objectives, what we're doing on the ground, and look at some pictures. And yeah, hope you enjoy. So biodiversity conservation. So here's a picture of our one of our most productive hop yards, and we look at biodiversity conservation as sort of our main tactics are minimizing disturbance, encouraging in-field diversity, protecting and restoring native habitats, and then toxics reductions. So I'll run through these and what we're doing there. So minimizing disturbance, this one's, pretty well known, no-till farming. It's pretty straightforward. This is our little no-till drill that fits down our hop rows. This is a no-till radish cover crop. You're probably all familiar with that. And so what we've done is, whenever possible, we are not working the ground. So the only times we have to work the ground is with our perennial crops to transition from one crop to another. We have posts and ditches and holes and old root systems, and you're pulling out an orchard, right? It's almost impossible not to work the ground at least once to get that remade, right? So but once those are in the ground, or in our annual cropping systems, we're not tilling the ground. A little more on minimizing disturbance. So you can see here, this is our production hop yard. I took it from two angles to show what it looks like, kind of looking perpendicular to the rows. It looks pretty wild. Once you start looking down the rows, you can see that we have actually maintained a pretty nice crop row and dry row or cover crop row. We kind of just let go and we, mow as least as we possibly can. Um, Infield diversity has been a big one that I think has accounted, for a lot of success in pest management stuff we'll talk about later. But, just a lot of folks just think about, well, let's just we cover cropped, or, and they work up the ground to plant a cover crop and then work the ground again, which to me has never made, a lot of sense in terms of soil health or biodiversity. And so what we've done is what I call like no-till cover cropping or overseeding. So we're just running over this again whenever we feel like there's not enough diversity out there. Um, and yeah, and so we have a mix of, weeds, but also flowering annuals, perennial grasses, everything out there. And then we sort of maintain these crop rows with herbicide applications, so we're not tilling the soil. Another component would be protecting, restoring native habitats. That's a big focus for us. So, we have all these beautiful riparian and edge habitats on our farm. And so focused on, instead of, clearing that land, or maybe spraying it right up to the trees, or really minimizing the vegetation, trying to create good edge habitat. You can see sort of there's a stepping stone right up to the edge of our hop yards there. So yeah, that's something we try to do in our management is, don't go in there and disturb those habitats unless we need to. We certainly have plenty of invasive species works to do, but that is an ongoing battle. Here's just another picture of some of our habitats. So this is some native rubus species here. I think I've been surprised. There's a lot of discussion in habitat and restoration circles about, we got to go plant this and we got to plant that. What we found on our farm, at least, is there's a lot of really nice native habitats there. It's just sort of managing for those. You can see We've got everything from a lot of cottonwood bottomlands, some prairies to like we do have a few stands of old growth Douglas fir out on the bluffs there. Um, and so we've got everything from forest species like snowberry here to like, rubus, cottonwood, riparian, all the way to lakes and ponds. So a big diversity of habitat. And we're trying to take advantage of that and let it really express itself for ecological function. So toxics reduction is the other part of this. That's, really Salmon Safe has been a huge leader on this for us. I think, they really take a sort of peer-reviewed science approach to pesticide management. So they're not saying don't use any pesticide products. They're saying don't use these ones that are determined to be the most hazardous for aquatic ecosystems. Um, really, I think aquatic ecosystems are probably just the most sensitive to pesticide products. It's really helped reduce our toxicity profile overall. Um, if anyone's familiar with this program, I've worked with it for 10 years and I'm close. We're really close with these guys, so please reach out. They've been great to work with. But basically, yeah, you have a high hazard list of do not use products that they, that to get their stamp of approval, you have to agree not to use. And we've been very successful with that program. So, we've really seen all this sort of bearing fruit. I think there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy here as you start to build this. And again, I really think it's holistic, but you get biodiversity, building biodiversity, helping starting to show in your crops. And I think it's sort of all three of all four of these components of biodiversity, you need to be focused on all of them. Um, a holistic approach. And what we've seen is a lot, both in our brief insect surveys, our crop scouts do predator counts. They're not necessarily trained entomologists, but they do predator counts. We've seen really good predator numbers, and I've seen those in the field, but then also results. So we're just having to spray a lot less insecticides, really hardly any insecticides anymore, which is really awesome. Um, but I think again, to the farm managers out there, it's like you have to sort of have to build this whole thing. I always talk about it like it doesn't do any good if you go through and like build up the house for the bugs to live in and then you just bury it all the next year, right? Because they're all gone. So you have to have some habitats for these creatures to, continue their life cycle and go on. And if I think that's something that's overlooked, there's a lot of focus on chemistries, right? Soft chemistries, but if you're not providing overwintering habitat in your fields, you're not, you know, you're going to either see those populations delayed as they takes time for them to come into the next season, or just not really thrive. And so I think that's a big part of it is looking at it as a system. Okay, on to the second pillar, um, water quality. So this is a picture of us. We're situated next to Deep Lake and Hubbard Lake, so we're part of a big ox system of oxbow lakes right next to the farm. This is a huge waterfowl overwintering area. There'll be like 10,000 ducks and geese on this lake when during the winter and fall. So that was from yesterday. So that's cool. We've all been talking about we really need to get canoes out and go explore this thing because it goes on for a long way. So, but anyway, yeah, water quality. So we kind of look at this as three components. So reduce soil erosion, just generally, um, reduce agricultural runoff specifically, and then conserve water resources specifically. So, if you've got nice clean water in a river, let's not pull it out and bring it into the ag system if it's not already there. Um, so water conservation and then making sure we're not impacting those waterways or groundwater. So here's a picture of our field edges looking down into a swale that's a seasonal wetland. The lake is to the east of here, looking towards the sun. So definitely a potential to move water or soil and erode water coming off of these fields down into this swale and down into the lake. So this is pretty commonplace of sort of how we manage our field borders. We try to keep them pretty well vegetated. Um, you know, we will do some light mowing to control invasive species like you see in this picture, but we're really not doing anything super heavy-handed in these natural areas, definitely not opening up exposed soil, unless we gotta dig up a pipe or something, which that tends to happen from time to time. But yeah, try to stay out of these and let the native wildlife and plants sort of do their thing. As you can see, there's a ton of reed canary grass down there. That's kind of I talk about next steps, but I think that's one of our big next steps at Westwood is how do we've been controlling Himalayan blackberry fairly well, but the reed canary grass, we haven't really gone after it yet. So that'll be it. That'll be next steps. Um, Again, a big part of reducing agricultural runoff, in addition to just no-till agriculture, which obviously, is probably the biggest thing and the first thing you should be doing. In addition, we just again try to maintain these sort of wild field borders, um, so that if there was to be runoff, it's going to be trapped in this vegetation. This is right down in the floodplain, so every winter we're getting water, flowing through this area, and so that field to the left that's you see it's kind of brown. That's just a newly planted field that we just planted. So we're trying to establish cover crops. It could be a challenge this spring with the with the dry weather, but okay, on to conserving water resources. So, there's sort of not impacting um, surface water with agricultural runoff, and then there's groundwater impacts. So we're all on wells. Um, Here in a very shallow, very, very shallow aquifer. Our water table on some of our wells is like 6 feet. So, and we're blessed. I mean, we have a lot of irrigation potential, but we don't look at that as, well, let's do whatever we want. We're still very focused on conservation. A big part of that, and something that I've been learning since I started at Westwood Farms, this was in place when I came, um, has been this automated irrigation system. So this is just a screenshot of my dashboard here. But I've found this to be hugely successful in terms of just irrigation efficiency, crop performance, your fertilizer applications, everything. It dials it in perfectly. And so you don't have sort of the, human error of an irrigator having to run around and make it to hit all these timers, and maybe he doesn't get to one, forgets to turn on the fertilizer pump, so he turns it on at the wrong time. This is all uh, very precision ag type precision irrigation, and it's really good. So I encourage you to take a look at. There's multiple systems like this, and this is Galileo from Galcon. But I think we're using much less than our water rights. I think we're using about a third of our allotted water right now. So um, that's a huge win. I think we get about most of our water rights are somewhere around 2.5 acre feet, and we're using less than a foot. All right, here's a shot of our soil moisture probe. I just kind of clicked on everything because it looks cool. But if anyone's familiar with soil moisture probes, this is something we're just starting to get online like this spring. Um, I worked with them some in my previous work, but it allows you to, dial in your soil water profile. Our sensors have EC sensors as well, so you can see where your salts or fertilizer are moving. So you can tell if you're pushing EC down, below the root zone, down to 30 inches, hey, we're leaching fertilizer into the aquifer, so we need to back off or change our fertigation approach, right? So that's a huge advantage of modern soil moisture sensors, being able to, you know, see exactly where your fertilizer is, and so you make sure that that actually gets taken up by the plant and it's not hanging out below the root zone. Um, Once again, this is a whole presentation on its own. People do this for a living, but it's yeah, we're kind of dabbling into it right now. So, and then I will end with climate resilience. So yeah, key management objectives there and soil carbon storage and reducing our carbon emissions. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with how plants store carbon in the soil. They breathe CO2 and take it into their root systems and biomass. And so I was shocked as I started to do more work, and Shannon is going to speak next, is probably much better versed in the science here, but my understanding is that um, I guess there's long and short of it is there's a lot of carbon in the soil and there's a lot of opportunity to um, sequester and at least offset your carbon usage on your farm. If you think about I mean, we do use quite a lot of diesel. We don't use that much that I don't think we could offset it. So yeah, again, soil carbon, it's just this pretty, anyone that's been involved in this, no-till cover cropping, that's all increasing your soil carbon. We're doing that. We did do a compost application this year, which let me tell you, compost application on 400 acres is no joke. It was, we learned a lot. We're doing some soil te health testing, and then, because we're no-till, we're reducing those really fuel consumptive tillage passes. So early in the process on the sort of the climate resilience carbon side, a lot of data taking and sort of accounting work that needs to be done for us to sort of prove out what we're doing. This is just a soil health test from one of our fields. I think we're looking okay. But really we've done this is the second year. So, we're not it's more about the 5 and 10 year trends to see where we're going and are all these practices going anywhere. So I'll talk about that and then hand it over to Shannon. So yeah, I think early successes, we've been able to maintain high crop yields while implementing this program. So that was really as the guy in charge of the business success of of the farming side of the operation, um, you know, I, and a crop advisor for a long time across conventional and organic farms and everything else. That was something that I really was a goal of mine is like, how, can we do this without dropping productivity? And so far, we're going into our third harvest here in September. So far, um, we have been able to maintain yields, implementing these practices, and my goal is to just kind of keep keep pushing until we, see any sort of reductions and then have a conversation about that. But, if we can keep those, if we can keep the high yields going, I think, you know, a lot of these practices are not so painful and pretty easy to implement. Observations, I guess, and pest control results suggest increasing biodiversity, right? I talked about that earlier, but I think, we're seeing that. I was out yesterday taking pictures. I did a little bird recording on my on my Merlin app there, and I think I got 14 species in one spot in 5 minutes. So this time of year, like the bird life is incredible. So these riparian areas we have, I mean, it's tens of thousands of ducks and stuff are using these every year. So that's really great to see. We are seeing a lot of wildlife. We're seeing results in sort of the insect pest control side of it, which is really promising. Um, but they're sort of observational right now. And then I mentioned water use. We're using roughly a third of our water right. I feel pretty good about that. I think there's more to do there. So next steps, I would say is, you know, like I talked about earlier, I'm going from observation to actually doing some biodiversity surveys. I've talked to a few professors on this, Nick Wyman, Lauren Hallett at U of O, who's doing the native cover crops work, and everyone's kind of said, "Well, uh, that's a big task to try to do a full biodiversity assessment." So we've talked about just trying to do some more citizen science, maybe some bird counts, organize, be part of some of these national bird counts, do something to try to put some metrics on it, but we haven't gotten there quite yet. A lot of soil carbon data analysis and data taking to be done. And then, something we're being asked by, you know, the big breweries, Heineken, they're starting to require enterprise level carbon analysis from their suppliers, of which we would be one of those, right? And it's making its way all the way down through the industry. I'd say the brewing industry is pretty progressive. They're looking at this. There's a lot of customers. Our hops go all over the world, so that's going to be a big focus. And then trying to integrate our irrigation systems, our soil moisture meters. We're trying to get a weather station out here right now, and so we can build an integrated irrigation model for hops at some point. But yeah, that's kind of where we're headed. So any questions? I think I saw 5 minutes for questions at the
We're a
program.
little bit behind on time. Why don't we go ahead and just turn it over to Shannon and we'll
Okay.
try and leave some time at the end. But please do, if you have questions for Andy, put them in the chat now so we can make sure we get to them. But thank you, Andy. I love the mix of, like supporting nature, helping biodiversity with pest control and with a lot of, the challenges of farming, while also using these really, kind of technology-based tools. That's fascinating to me to see the mix of the two and how they can really work together to be successful. So, looks like Shannon's all ready. All right, let's go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Andy, thank you for that presentation. That it leads into this very well. And we can kind of get into a little bit more of some of the theory behind what he's doing. Um, the first thing I want to do is I want everybody to just spend a minute while we're sitting here processing what Andy's saying, and I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about, imagine the best smelling soil you've ever experienced. Think about that smell. What kind of feelings does that bring up? And what do you see around you? What does the soil look like? What do the plants above that soil look like? What kind of organisms might you see? Do you get a sense of what that soil feels like when you're thinking about that really good smelling soil? It's a little bit interesting doing this not in person because normally I'm looking around the room, and when I ask somebody to think about the best smelling soil, they often have a smile on their face. There are literally chemicals produced by soil organisms that hit the same kind of serotonin pathways in our brain as antidepressants. This geosmin is this smell of this like beautiful fresh soil that we often see. Um, I don't think we're going to ask people to come off of their mute right now, but as you were thinking about that good smelling soil, you might have seen a dark, rich, maybe crumbly soil that was full of different organisms. Maybe there were earthworms and roots. Maybe you saw some kind of white thread-like fungal mycelium in there. Maybe there was a big diversity of plants above ground and it felt moist and easy to get your hands in. Most people can kind of conjure some kind of idea of what that healthy soil looks like, it smells like, it feels like. And I think that's kind of a useful way to frame that you know what healthy soil is. You know what we're looking for when we're talking about soil health. You have an idea of it. Soil scientists have also come up with a definition, and I think that definition is pretty useful. The definition we have decided on, settled on to a certain degree. There's a lot of different iterations of it, but generally, soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains life. And I really like this definition for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's talking about, the soil, it can either continue in its ability to do this or it can be ended. And really, we're talking about functions. We're talking about the soil doing work. There are things that we need from the soil. There have been people, you can do a whole PhD on soil. I was like, of course you can. It's like the most important thing that like sustains all of our lives. And the soil has a really hard time doing those functions unless it is that living ecosystem. Some people will talk about, oh, well, if I add chemicals, if I killed my soil, it's almost impossible to kill everything in the soil. Like it is nearly impossible to make it sterile. But you can really change the ecosystem with a lot of different practices. And so to have that vital, living, diverse ecosystem, that is what really allows the soil to do a lot of the work and sustains life. And so I want to start by really talking about what are those functions that we need the soil to do. And again, most of the time everybody's muted, so I'm not going to ask for this now, but I normally ask for people to kind of think about what those functions are. What is it that we need the soil to do for us? And so I have it kind of broken up. You can say the 5 functions of soil. You can list it in 21 functions of soil, like the FAO does. I have it broken here into kind of 9 very, very concrete, tangible functions of soil. And that first one is water infiltration. We need the soil to be able to let water in. We'll talk more about how we get there, but that first just step of water infiltration. We also need the soil to be able to store that water. Once that water gets into the soil, we want it to be able to stay there so that it can be plant available a week after it's rained, or maybe even 2 months after it's rained for a Mediterranean climate system like ours. And then the last step of that water is we also need the soil to perform the function of filtration. There are all sorts of organisms that are in the soil and soil structures that are in there that help to filter that, so that as the water moves through the soil, it's being cleaned before it ends up in groundwater or in any of those surface waters that we're working with. And so the way that we manage the soil has an influence then on the soil's ability to infiltrate, hold that water, and filter that water. And I love that Andy was talking about, like, these are outcomes that are really important to what they're doing. I often will talk about the soil health work in terms of outcomes. What is it that these are the tangible benefits that you're really trying to get after? And he talked about that diversity and like water quality and not just diversity for the sake of diversity, which is important in many ways, but thinking about it in terms of pest control. That has that tangible function that's actually going to help a farmer. And when there is that tangible function, that outcome that's related to that diversity, that can help somebody to understand the why. Or for some people, it's just because it's going to be a cost benefit, right? All of those things are real reasons to work on this. Okay, so we talked a little bit about water functions. We also have nutrient functions. The soil does a huge amount in cycling nutrients. If soil didn't cycle nutrients, if it didn't take dead organic matter and turn it into smaller pieces that then smaller organisms can get to until they're in a form that the plants can get to it, we just have piles of organisms all over the place. We don't want that. The soil performs these jobs of breaking down organic matter, whether that's in the form of a manure or an animal carcass or a leaf or a compost. It's taking these forms of organic matter and transforming them. And the microbes do a huge amount of this work. And all of the different kinds of organisms in the soil take part in this continual process of breaking down carbon and breaking down the nutrients so that plants can then recycle it and grow more biomass for that primary production from the system. And so they are cycling these nutrients. Soil is also a place where we store these nutrients. The little outside rough edges of each piece of soil or soil aggregate have these charges, and the nutrients can stick to the soil. And again, the way that we manage the soil is going to have an influence on what kind of nutrient storage and availability is there for those plants as the nutrients are being cycled in the system. Often one of the functions we talk about is that it is just a habitat for organisms. And we can break this down into a lot of different ways, but soil is the most diverse habitat anywhere in the planet. There is a recent paper that came out that says 60% of all organisms on the entire globe live in the soil. 60% of habitat diversity in the globe is in the soil. There are all sorts of different kinds of organisms doing all sorts of different jobs that we are barely just getting a handle on in the soil microbial community. Um, but they're doing the work for us. They're the ones who are performing these functions. And so one of the things we need out of the soil itself is to be a place for these organisms to live. Another important role of the soil is in atmospheric gas regulation. So a lot of the organisms that are in the soil are what we call heterotrophs. That means they take carbon into their body and they're exhaling CO2. Now, it's definitely not all the organisms, but a lot of them that are doing these things like cycling nutrients and building aggregates, they are exhaling CO2. It is normal and natural for CO2 to be coming out of the soil. At the same time, we have this is a medium for plant growth, right? We have plants that are doing that above ground work with photosynthesis. They're capturing carbon from the atmosphere, and they send a huge amount of the carbon that they capture through photosynthesis down into the roots and out into the soil. When they're taking that carbon from the atmosphere and putting it down into the soil and into the roots, they're feeding those organisms and they're putting that carbon back where it belongs. Andy was talking a little bit about kind of the definition of regeneration. And there are a lot of definitions. I also love the one from Kiss the Earth, Kiss the Ground. One of the things I think about is when we use these soil health practices, we are regenerating the soil's function. We are regenerating that soil's capacity to function as a vital living ecosystem that restores health. And part of the way we do that is we are regenerating the carbon that's supposed to be in the soil. There was about 50% of the carbon that was once in the top 3 feet of soil is now gone. They say that over about the last 100 years, we've lost about 50% of the carbon that was in soil. So when we talk about regenerating the land and using practices like soil health that work in this regeneration model and thinking about holistic ecosystem management, part of what we're needing to do is kind of switch the pump. Right now, typically in agriculture, we're sending a lot more carbon out of the system than we're putting back into it. And when we're talking about this regeneration, we're talking about finding ways of getting more carbon back into the soil. And that's not just because that's where it's supposed to be. You know, the matter can't be created or destroyed. It has to go somewhere. And so if we've lost that carbon from the soil, it's going into the atmosphere. Our job is to take that from the atmosphere and get it back down into the soil so that we can get back to a potentially a more stable climate. And also because those organisms in the soil, they need that carbon so that we can do these other functions, so that we can have that continued plant productivity and sustainability. And then the last one that we have on here, just because, you know, a lot of times we think about this very much from an agricultural production standpoint. The other one is as an engineering medium. We can use soil materials for building different systems, especially for water management. And it's also something that we build on top of. And understanding a little bit more about the soil properties really helps us to make smart, wise decisions about where a road is going to be, or a gate in a pasture, or a new building, or where we can move some soil to create a temporary water basin, things like that. And so these are kind of just some of those basic functions of soil. I often spend way too long on this. I realize that we're going to be over time here in a minute. So I'm going to go through some of the other stuff more quickly, but I do like to think about, like, this is what we need out of the soil. The reason that we're doing these soil health practices is so that the soil can provide these services for us. In the soil health world, we have kind of come up with these principles of what we can do generally to allow the soil to perform these functions. And number one, or at least I call it number one, is increasing live roots. As many plants out there as much of the year as possible, with as many different kinds of root architectures as possible. Increasing cover is another one that we talk about. And often we'll talk about that, you know, live plant roots are a great way to have cover. Dead plant biomass is a way to have cover. Just having a plastic sheet can also be a way to have that soil mineral surface covered. Increasing diversity, Andy talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk more about it in here, but it really aids in that overall ecosystem function. Minimizing disturbance, we're going to talk more about, and then integrating livestock, we'll talk more about that one as well. I've got a lot of information on here about like why we do these things. Maximizing living roots, there are a lot of functions that those plants are serving. We need the plants to provide some of these services so that the soil can function. So those plants are protecting that surface. They are moderating that temperature and moisture. They are creating these flow pathways. We need pathways in the soil for not only the water to move in, but also the air. We need these pore spaces in the soil so that air can be exchanged, so that the organisms have room in their habitat, and so that the water can move in there. And then that big part of it too is taking that carbon from the atmosphere and putting it down into the soil so that we can feed the organisms, because we need the plants to feed the organisms, because we need the organisms to perform these functions. Okay, so different ways that we maximize living roots. I think Andy's doing a great job with a lot of these things. Growing crops in their off season, using cover crops in a perennial system, having these perennial mixed season plants where they are overseeding and adding new diversity into it. Anytime where you can be increasing the amount of plants in your system, it can be very beneficial. You want to think about what plants you're using though, right? What are the goals? Each plant has a different purpose. And so as we're thinking about how do we maximize these living roots, you want to think about what your goals are. I love that Andy kind of came forward. These are our three main goals. These are the objectives that we have, and why we're working on these goals. And they've selected plants that are going to work to achieve those particular goals. So there's a lot of different methods that we can use for maximizing living roots, whether we're in a perennial system, an annual system, or an integrated livestock system. Minimizing disturbance. This is another one of those main principles we talk about. One of the things I talk about most frequently when it comes to minimizing disturbance is providing space for that habitat. One of the things that microbes are doing is they are building structures. This picture down here, this is a scanning electron microscope of microbial exudates. They basically exude different carbon products out of their body that becomes their home. It's where they trap food. It's how they glue particles together. It's where they communicate. It's where they're doing all of this stuff. And as they do this, they build aggregates. There are proteins that bind to that mineral surface and glue things together. And it creates these homes. It creates this really complex three-dimensional structure. As they're building these aggregates, an aggregate is a conglomeration of silt, sand, and clay-sized particles that are held together in some way. When we create these stable aggregates that are held together by microbial glues, they resist that change when there's water. And so if you just had, loose soil particles and you put water in there, they would just all fall apart. When you have these active microbial communities and habitats, they glue these particles together. So even when water comes in, there's still these groups of soil particles. And that allows for some really big pore spaces, because instead of just having these small single grains of soil mineral particles, we have chunks of them. And that allows for pore size variation. And those large pores are going to allow water in and allow gases in and allow this exchange and this flow. And the small pores are going to be holding the water, and they're going to be holding that carbon, and they're going to keep things really close to each other for that tight cycling. And so one of the things that we talk about when we're minimizing disturbance is ways to continue to build this aggregate structure so that so that we have this variation in pore size habitat. How do we minimize disturbance? I think the first thing most people talk about and think about is reducing tillage. And that is absolutely, where we need to start with this. We want to try to minimize it. That doesn't mean we're never putting equipment in the ground. It doesn't mean that we are never going to do, a pasture renovation or anything like that. But it's doing it conscientiously. It's doing it with purpose. It's not going to the same 6-inch depth 6 times a year that creates a big plow pan. There are also other things that can cause disturbance. Putting a chemical into the soil disturbs that microbial community. Adding a synthetic fertilizer disturbs that microbial community. Now, there's always trade-offs, and there's always okay, well, which way is going to be better? How are we going to maximize our goals? And so for me, there's a time and a place for each of these different practices. And the goal is to try to maximize that ecosystem function, try to maximize that soil's ability to perform these functions. And sometimes and that will mean a reduction to get to that ecological state. But nobody expects it to happen overnight, and nobody expects you to just drop everything right away. It's a process. It's a as you start to see that ecosystem coming back on and that soil doing more of the work for you, what else can you decrease? How else can we minimize the disturbance to that ecological system? And so a huge part of that is using plants. How can this plant serve the function that we need to do, that we used to use some kind of chemical for? Maximizing cover. Like I said, living plants, great for this. Plant residue, also great for it. But even a plastic mulch helps. And part of that is because when the water drop hits that soil surface, there is this huge dislodging of soil particles. You see this picture here of this splash. By the time a raindrop hits the ground, it is going fast and hard, and it can dislodge soil. And you can see a completely sealed off soil surface, especially if you have bare ground. And so part of that maximizing cover is to reduce erosion. Erosion reduction is a huge goal for a lot of folks who are getting into that soil health path. And so it can really help to protect loss of soil, especially that very top soil that has more organic matter and is really vital for operation. Maximizing cover is also going to minimize weed germination. It's going to provide more habitat, and it has a huge benefit for moderating that soil temperature and moisture. Like I said, lots of ways to do this: cover cropping, intercropping, mulching, controlled traffic so that you're, walking the animals down a small path, timing of grazing, and using things like livestock sacrifice areas. All of these are strategies for how we maximize that cover. Maximizing biodiversity. This is something that I think Andy did a great job on. And I also just want to say, we only can describe about 1% of the soil microbes. We talked about the fact that there are more microbes and more soil organisms than anywhere else in the entire planet. And only 1% of those are described. And most of that is because we can't grow them in pure culture. They don't survive or do their jobs. They can't perform all of the functions they need to survive on their own. They need each other. They need that biodiversity. You can think about each different kind of organism in the soil being like a different part of a cellular organism. There are some that it is their job to hold information. Others remove the waste. Others do clean out and waste removal, and some of them are in that nutrient cycling. So each of the, if you want to think about like building a Sims city or a cell, there's different roles for each different organism, and we need all of them there in order to have that optimal functioning in the soil that's going to allow us to really get to a point of ecological health. A huge part of this, and I'm glad that Andy talked about this again, is that part of that tangible outcome for that biodiversity is in that pest-prey balance. And that goes to, whether we're talking about supporting habitat for birds who are going to eat the insects, or to have some kinds of insects that are eating other organisms. The same thing happens at that microbial level in the soil when we're talking about disease and pests and a balanced nutrient cycling system. So all of these things work from that soil level up through the entire agroecosystem. Lots of ways to maximize biodiversity. increasing the number of different species of cash crops and cover crops or uh, strips on the edges. Integrating livestock is another form of that biodiversity and building those habitat structures. Um, I know that I wanted to give you one more slide here talking about soil health, and this slide just says soils are different. Don't try to compare Willamette silty clay loam with an Ontario sandy soil. They're going to be different. We expect different things out of them, and so we need to group them. Um, and texture is a primary grouping function. A fine texture soil has more capacity to hold more nitrogen and hold more water, and so we use that as part of our primary grouping when we're talking about soil health assessments. And then once we have kind of our soils categorized, we want to think about like what is their potential. So this is an example from Pendleton, Oregon. These two soils are both in a Walla Walla silt loam. The one that you can see my foot, that's been in a wheat fallow tilled chemical system for the last 80 years, and the other has been in a perennial grassland with minimal management. So what we did is we took this minimum suite of soil health indicators and we measure what kind of that low end with no soil health management might look like and what that upper potential might look like, where we've taken on all the soil health management practices. That's what I call these bookend samples. And then I compare that to the sample in the field, right? And so on our low end, we've got 0.8 for total carbon. The sample itself was in a wheat pea no-till rotation. We get up to 1.7 on that total organic carbon. And that upper potential is 2.2. So we've made this huge amount of progress. And having these bookends kind of gives us a where are we on our path to soil health in what is reasonable for our system. These are the three soil health indicators that I would consider that minimum set of soil health indicators: total organic carbon, respiration, and aggregate stability. Total carbon is that total amount of feedstock that might be available. CO2 is, are the microbes actually active? Are they doing work with it? And then aggregate stability, are they actually building useful structures that are going to be that habitat for the organisms and the water and the air to be able to move and function in the system? And so they kind of work together in that system to give a general idea if we're moving in the right direction for soil health. 20 minutes is hard for me to talk about soil health. I would love to talk more with people other times. I've got lots of things to share with you. But, you know, overall, if we come away with something is that soil function depends on the life in it, and all life depends on the soil's ability to work. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Shannon. That was amazing. We can stay on if you can stay on, Shannon and Andy, for a few more minutes, we can take questions. If you need to jump, we totally understand, but please stay around if you have a few more minutes to ask questions of our speakers. And then I'm going to share my screen one last time. If you're looking for credit, please follow the link to our evaluation. We also would love to just get feedback from anyone who attended about our webinar, and we'll enter you in a drawing for a Wild Farm Alliance hat if you complete our evaluation. So please do that. Let's see, any questions in the chat? All right, well, seeing no questions, I will let everyone go. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your wealth of information. Seeing the work happening out in the field is really inspiring. So I'll share the recording shortly. If you think of any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll connect you with our speakers.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Ashley and Wild Farm Alliance, and look forward to being more involved. So yeah, that was great, Shannon, and look forward to getting more involved with you.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. There's a lot of common goals and ways that I'd love to work with you. So let's talk a little bit more about opportunities
Yeah.
for collaboration.
Yeah, no, we're all about it. So that would be
Great.
super cool.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.